Hello again! In the last video we created a simple yet effective lighting setup for our product presentation. In this video we will work on the materials using subsurface scattering, some material-based ambient occlusion, and we'll create a clear plastic material that doesn't darken the stuff behind it. So let's go! And we're back in this scene with the spray bottle. The first material we want to look at is this plastic body of the spray bottle. And that's a very easy material. So what we want is a shiny, glossy white plastic. And essentially by adding a principled shader set to almost white, we just leave it there. We get a white material, and by turning down the roughness to 0.2, we make it a little bit more shiny. Now, the principled shader, which already takes care of the diffuse and the glossy and the Fresnel effect and all of that for us, basically is all we really need for a plastic material. We can have it super shiny with the roughness or super rough. So I went for 0.2. When doing materials like this, it's always very good to have the actual product in your hand. So you can hold it up to a light, or you can really check out in detail what the material looks like and how it behaves. But this is really very easy. It's all you really need. But we're gonna do something with this. We're gonna make it look a little softer. So this is a very hard surface now. So every light ray that hits the surface gets reflected, and we get this very nice, clean, white plastic. But we can make it look like a softer plastic. I don't know if that makes any sense, but by adding subsurface scattering, you've maybe heard about subsurface scattering. What is it? Basically, it's light entering the material. So the light rays don't just bounce off of the surface, which we have now. We actually have light entering the material, gets scattered around underneath the surface, and some of it just, disappears basically, or gets eaten up. And some of it actually makes it back out. And it can come out on the other side, or actually on the side that we're looking at, or the side that the light entered. Quick info, I have a video explaining subsurface scattering and comparing cycles to Eevee on my channel, link is in the description. The best example for a subsurface scattering is usually skin. And that is also the reason why in here, the subsurface radius, we have these values. So this is red, green and blue. And you can see that red is all the way up, green is 0.2 and blue is 0.1. That's basically a default subsurface setting for skin. So if I set the subsurface mix here to 0.5, we can see that we get this sort of red tint. Of course, we don't want that. So we go in here, we change the subsurface radius to 0.15, something small. And I also copied I believe it's the same anyway. But I just want the same color that I have for the plastic, also in the subsurface color. So we're not really changing the color of the light under the surface. We have the same color, but what that does is it makes the plastic look softer, like it is a softer, squishier plastic. And we can usually see that not only at the edges, where we might get some light passing through now, like when you hold a flashlight up to your fingers, you can see the light through your fingers. That's what we will get here on the edges, where the light makes it, through the material. But we also get softer shadows, like for example here. If I turn this off, you can see this is very, it's a very hard glossy surface. And with this 0.5 subsurface, so we're only mixing in 0.5 subsurface. We might as well turn it up to a full 1 here, but I'm just going to mix my glossy diffuse principled white color with some subsurface. And this effect is very subtle in this case because we're not changing the color of the subsurface color here, or with the subsurface radius. We have the same color in there. So we're just softening up the, for example, shadows, and it gives us sort of a softer plastic effect. Here I have rendered 2 images. This one has no subsurface scattering on it, and this one does have subsurface scattering on it. Now, like I said, this effect is very subtle, and it really depends, of course, on the settings that we do here, the subsurface radius and the amount of subsurface that we want. But we get a little bit of a, almost like a shadow, an inside shadow around where the sticker is and where no light can pass through the sticker. And we can sort of see through this. And I believe in the next video I will show you a cool effect using the subsurface scattering, how to make it look like there's liquid inside of this bottle. So I don't know if this even shows up in the video, but this surface or this plastic here actually looks a little softer to the touch. It's also a little bit darker. Okay, so this is very subtle, and all we really need is this one principled shader. So this is, we call this done. Next material, I'm not gonna go into detail here, but I just want to show you. I've shown this before in other tutorials. This is always how I do stuff like stickers. So I created this transparent PNG image in Illustrator, but you can do it with whatever software you want. And I use the color information of this image for this principled shader, and then I use the alpha information to mix in this white principled shader. So now I have control over just the white background all around here, and I have control over the colored parts, and I could even do something like change the roughness of the printed areas where the color is, make it a little bit more rough, and keep the white more glossy. Again, you have to look at the sticker that you have, or the print that you have in detail, and hold it up to a light and see how it reacts and how it behaves. Right, that's it for the sticker. Whoops, I wanted to do this. Next material, and that's one that is actually a little bit more fun, and it's the transparent plastic cap up here. Let me just show it. So I have this transparent cap up here, again just modeled out of a cylinder, and then with some edge loops, and I believe I have a subdivision surface on here, adaptive. And the material for this is supposed to be a transparent plastic. So again, I have a principled shader. I have the roughness set to 0.2 in this case, because it is not 100% clear plastic. The color is almost white. I have set the transmission to 1, right? So it becomes a transmissive material. Instead of this, we could actually use a glass shader. And I also changed the IOR to 1.2. The default here is 1.45, I believe, which is glass. Yeah, 1.45. But the 1.45 looks weird for plastic. It looks too much like glass. And it doesn't look like the plastic cap that I have on this spray bottle. So I just turned this down a little, so that's that. But, and now the fun begins. We can see one thing that we always get with transmissive materials. We have this spray top thing here behind our transmissive material, and you can see it turns darker. So if I hide my clear cap, look at how bright and white this material here is. And if I show this clear cap again, then you can see how much darker this gets. Everything behind our glass or clear plastic gets darker. Now we have to start faking some things and using some magic ray tracing or path tracing trickery to get this back to the white that we actually want. Because I just can't go in here and turn this white up any whiter. Instead, we have to work with this plastic material. We have to find a way to make the stuff behind it brighter. So what's happening is this material, although it is 100% transmissive, because it has some refraction and because of course we can't simulate an infinite amount of camera rays, it eats up some of the light, basically. Right, so there are some ways to get around this, and one very easy way, and I think it is the way that looks best, is to take a transparent shader and mix it in with our, basically a glass shader here. So this is our plastic, and we mix in transparent. Now this looks weird, and we have to plug in a factor here, and we take the light path. And I have been playing with all sorts of different variations of these outputs here. If you've never used the light path node before, an easy way to make it visible what it does or what all these are, because when I control shift click on these, we only ever get either white or black, so this doesn't really help us. But for example, I turn this to red and plug in this as the factor, and now I can make the output of this light path node visible. So everything that's red now is the output of this. Okay, so here we see the diffuse rays, right? Makes sense. This is a white plastic material, so it's diffuse and glossy. So this is the diffuse part, and this would be the glossy part. Now everything is red because the plastic clear cap is also glossy. Is singular ray, nothing is red. Is reflection ray. Now here we get an interesting output where we have the plastic spray top in the middle, but also those reflective rays where we get reflections on our actual clear cap. And then there's shadow ray. Now this actually looks like what we want. We get some red right here where our material gets too dark, where where we have too much shadow, basically. So what we could do is take away the redness here and render it like this. And you can see our plastic is not so dark anymore. But if I switch back to the original, let's look at the clear cap itself here. See how we see the outline here, and it looks like a plastic cap. But when we look at this now, we actually lose detail. We lose all of the shadow detail on our white piece in the middle, and also we can't really tell that there is this edge here. So this eats away too much. Now the solution for this is to add a converter math node, and we can set it to add, or actually we can use maximum, doesn't matter in this case. And we take the shadow and the diffuse, and now we can see we have this edge in here back. We have actually some shadow information left, but this plastic in the middle here, this white plastic, isn't quite as dark as just with the principled BSDF. So here it's dark. How many samples do I have here? 64. And when I use this output, we still have the nice looking cap. We can see its shape and stuff, but the plastic is whiter. Of course, this is just, you know, sort of a trick. We're not really physically correct anymore, but then again, we really have to make sure that the final result looks good. So this is the setup that I came up with. Another setup you can try out is to use the is shadow and is reflection maximum for the factor, which gives us this. Also, the plastic is very nice and bright, but with this setup, we lose the detail of the clear plastic cap here. And when we look at this, this is actually where the cap is, where its outer edge is. And with this setup where we take the reflection ray and all of this very outer edge here is reflection, and we're turning this into transparent. So this looks a bit weird, I think. Now these kinds of setups here with the different rays and adding them together and using this as a factor is also sometimes called an architectural glass, where we want reflections to show up, but we don't really want it to be in the way of our light rays. So if you're interested in this kind of stuff, you might want to look up what an architectural glass shader looks like. It's always something like this. So like I said, I think that the shadow and diffuse looks the best for this setup. Here I have a comparison, rendered out the different setups. So this is the top here without the clear cap on top. This is rendered with just the principled shader or the glass shader, where the inside gets much darker. Here I have a rendering where I took just the is shadow ray output and turned that into transparent, and we can see that we lose the detail here of this edge, and also this is much too bright now. Actually, this is brighter now than it was here. This over here is the rendering with the is shadow ray plus is reflection ray, which changes the look of this plastic cap in a weird way. I don't like it at all. It turns the plastic here completely transparent, and also these highlights here look kind of blown out. So the inside looks good, but the plastic cap itself doesn't look good anymore. And this is the is shadow ray plus is diffuse ray. Now compared to looking at this here and then looking at this, the inside looks pretty much the same, and the outer clear plastic cap still looks good. We still have all the outer edges visible. So I think that this is my favorite solution. What do you think? Please let me know in the comments below. Or maybe you know of a better setup to get materials behind transmissive materials to look right. This is what I'm going with. And that's what I have here now. Is shadow ray, is diffuse ray. That's it. Okay, now we could call it done. But now this whole image is quite bright. I mean, the lights are very bright, and we might want to play with those a little. So we could turn down our main key light just a little bit. Also we have this light that I think that only shows up in glossy, doesn't cast shadows, but this one, we could bring it down a little so that we don't have that much light in the scene. By the way, a good way to find out is in the Filmic color management. We can go to, in the view transform here, we can go to false color, and stuff that is very bright, like right here, we are quite bright, but we actually, generally we want this green and gray mix here. So we know that we're not blowing out any highlights. That looks pretty good. You can go to Filmic. Of course, you can also go to standard color transform if you want to keep 100% of the colors, but then you have to go in and change your light settings and everything again. I find that rendering in Filmic and then maybe after the fact, after rendering, either using the compositor or Photoshop, maybe tweaking the color grading, the overall color grading, to get back the original colors of the corporate design that was used here. The next thing I want to do with this image is I want to add in some more contrast. Everything is bright and white. And actually, when rendering, see, I have viewport samples set to 64, but when I render it with 1000 samples, this stuff even gets brighter because we're throwing more light at it, or we're calculating more light rays, and this will be even brighter. So I want to add some contrast. Now, one way to add contrast, again, this is not physically correct. It's not a shadow, it's sort of a fake shadow, is ambient occlusion. One way to do this is just to go in here and switch it on for the entire scene. And then give this a render, but I will turn this down to 512 so it goes a little faster. And hit F12. Okay, with this rendering done, we can go over to the compositor and we get this ambient occlusion output here because we switched on this render pass. And if I look at this directly, this is what the ambient occlusion looks like. Ambient occlusion is, like I said, it's not a shadow. It has nothing to do with the lighting in your scene. All it does is it calculates the distance between objects. So right here, the distance between this ground plane to any other object is far enough away to be basically white. And the further or the closer we get to this bottle, it gets darker and darker. Now the way this is calculated is we shoot out rays in all sorts of directions from this point, for example, and we hit this bottle so we know that we're a certain distance away from the next surface. And the closer we get, or even under here, you can see that it's very dark, almost black, because the ambient occlusion rays calculated here, they hit another object immediately. Also, the bottle gets darker. See, the bottle is much brighter up here than down here. Because, of course, the surface of the bottle also has ambient occlusion now, and the rays calculated out here hit the bottom, or the ground plane. We also get this interesting line around here. And then, of course, we get this nice, sort of like a shadow here, and all these contrast lines here. And using ambient occlusion, again, this is not physically correct, but we can use it to add back some contrast. Because when we look at the render result here, looking at this, we can hardly tell the difference between this and this. So if we could turn the outside here a little darker, then this bottle would pop a little bit more. That's easily done right here in the compositor. We take a color mix node and we multiply our ambient occlusion on top of it. Okay, so this is the render result. Okay, and this is with the ambient occlusion multiplied. So we have a darker area around here, and this is really dark now. We also get this darker edge here and a little bit more detail here in this piece. So this is overall ambient occlusion for the entire scene. Now let me just mute this node so we have our original again. What I want to show you here is we can also do it per material. So I go to the ground plane, which is this material setup that we did in the last video. I just removed this node, we don't need that. With our transparent mix in to make the ground plane fade into transparent in the back. And what we have here is we can add in input ambient occlusion, and by Control Shift clicking on that, we get the ambient occlusion information, but we only get it on the ground plane now. So right now our ground plane here is rendered with this ambient occlusion information. So again, we get this darker area down here, almost looks like a shadow, and then we get this fade to white. The distance here is the distance of the calculation. So if we turn that down to something like 0.3, now those rays that I was talking about before, looking for other objects to hit, will only be calculated to a maximum set here. So we get a darker area around the bottle here, but we get perfectly white out here. So turning down the distance here is good. Also, we can turn up the samples if we get too much noise, because of course, like I said, this is a calculation. By the way, this also slows down our rendering. Inside is basically flipping the normals. So if I switch it to inside, we have no ambient occlusion effect because we're actually calculating the bottom of this ground plane now. So we don't want that. And only local would be only calculate these bouncing rays for this object. So since this is a flat plane, the ambient occlusion of this flat plane, only looking at the flat plane, never hits anything, so it's perfectly white. And without this switched off, it also knows when it hits other objects like the spray bottle. That's why we get this darker area down here. We could also color this ambient occlusion, but we're just going to leave it white. Now, since my ground plane is white, I can very easily just plug this in here, go back to our material, and now we have, this is without, just looking at the ground plane. This is with ambient occlusion. We're changing the color of our ground plane based on the ambient occlusion information. This makes this very dark, and the effect that I was looking for is actually not very visible. So we're just gonna go in here, take a color RGB curve. Now this super dark area here, I want to brighten that up a little, so I'm bringing this up so it's not so dark. But then those areas out here that are dark gray, so like in this region here, I'm just gonna bring those down. Okay, so now we can really see we have a darker ground here closer to the spray bottle, and the spray bottle is now brighter than the ground plane. So without this, it's like almost the same here. And with this little trick here, we add a little bit of contrast just to this ground plane, or to this area where the bottle is placed onto our ground plane. So this looks pretty cool. Remember in our composite that we had before, we also had this nice dark shadow up here from our ambient occlusion. And also in here, we get more detail in here. So we could take this part, which is just our white plastic that we created with a little bit of subsurface on it. And we can do the same thing. Input, ambient occlusion, color curve, plug that in here, and in here, turn up the samples, set the distance really low in this case, because we only really want it to be checking very close ambient occlusion rays. Okay, so that gives us this darker part here now. So this is Oh, and you know what? Since we're looking at like 50% surface color and 50% subsurface, we also have to plug it into the subsurface. Now we really get a darker area here. So this is it without, and that's with. Again, doing this kind of thing here. So now we have detail in here. We can see a little bit of, well, it almost looks like shadow, but of course it's not. Don't want it to be too dark though. Okay, so now we added back some detail, some contrast. One thing I noticed down here, let's see, with this distance set to 0.1, we get this nice shadowy thing here, which I really like, but what I don't like is it is darkening the bottom here. This plastic shouldn't be darker down here just because it's closer to this ground plane. It should be the same white plastic, right? Well, that's one of the problems that you end up with when you start doing fake stuff like this. But again, we could do something about it if we wanted to. Now we're really playing with materials here, so that's what this tutorial is about. Doesn't mean that you have to do this, of course, but I just want to show you some stuff that you can do. So remember what we did with the ground plane, fading to transparent? Well, let's do something similar right here. Now, what I want to do is I take, you know what, we're going to do it differently. We're going to take a gradient texture. With that selected, hit Ctrl T on the keyboard, which inserts these two nodes with the Node Wrangler add-on enabled. Take the object and then we look at this gradient. What do we have here? Set to texture. We have this gradient going from left to right. Okay. Right, so we want to turn it 90 degrees and scale it down and move it up on the C. Okay, let me zoom in here. So I rotated the vector mapping here 90 degrees on the Y so that the gradient is not going from left to right, but from top to bottom, like this. Then with this scale here, if I set that to 0.5, I have more of a gradient. Set it to 0.1, I get a sharper gradient, which is nice. And then on the C location here, I can basically move this gradient up and down my bottle now. So what I want to do is something like this. This is good. Remember this ambient occlusion output here. That gives us this shadow contrast effect here. And also darkens down the bottom here, which is what we don't want. Well, now we have this. And we just do color mix. And how about we add it on top of, or we could use this as a factor and add white. And now looking at this, we have the ambient occlusion here, but not down here. So the bottle isn't getting darker. Or I just plug this in here and use this for the color and the subsurface color. Now I hope I plugged all of this in. Add, oh, factor 1. Factor 1 is always good. Right, here we have ambient occlusion and here we don't. This looks like it's too bright now. Why is this too bright now? Oh, okay, switching on clamp so we don't go over a value of 1. Now we generally have a little bit more contrast in our image. Here I have rendered out two shots, this one without this ambient occlusion effect and this is with. Maybe it's a little strong in this image, but you get the idea. We have more contrast going down here, and that's the goal of this whole thing. Also the top here, we have more detail here. It's more obvious what this piece actually looks like. We get this nice shadow down here. I don't like this in the middle here, but of course there's again ways around this. This is just a quick render to show the differences. And I think we have our materials done. And that's it for this one, guys. I hope there was some useful content in here. If you learned something, please hit that like button and go check out my page chrisp.zone for more. I already have a couple of ideas for the next product presentation video, so make sure you're subscribed and check out the other videos on my channel. Thank you for watching. Chris P out.